Associate Professor Peter Bakers from the University of Sydney joins us to tell us about another one of our probably less known little forms of local wildlife. We've had bandicoots and bush rats, and today we're moving on to a very tiny little one that some people actually love, Antechinus. Thank you for joining us, Peter.
It's a pleasure.
Tell us about this one. Every time I hear about him or her, it seems to be a message of woe about how suburbs don't really seem to be doing the right thing by them.
That'd probably be true because a lot of people probably confuse them for a mouse because they're about the size of a mouse, but they're not a mouse at all. They're not a rodent. They're a marsupial. They're one of our carnivorous marsupials, and they're amazing animals. They are doing quite well since Europeans arrived here. Species that we have around Sydney is Antechinus stewardi, which translates to Stewart's hedgehog equivalent, and it's doing quite okay. There's no signs that it's in trouble. However, it does get into people's houses occasionally, and people possibly do mistake it for a house mouse and then set some kind of trap or whatever for them to get rid of them. But I think that's probably a bad idea because they're not like house mice at all. And they probably do some quite positive things around the house for people, like getting rid of cockroaches and so forth, because they're largely insectivorous animals. They'll eat cockroaches and spiders and so forth. And they're fantastic little animals. They don't smell like house mice at all. House mice tend to smell a little bit like corn chips, whereas Antechinus have got this really sweet smell. They run around flowers and do pollination jobs by transferring pollen around banksias, etc. So they're a really positive thing to have around, I think.
They sound like they really are very small.
They're about the size of a house mouse. They weigh about 30 to 50 grams. The males are a lot bigger than the females, and that's because they have a very bizarre sex life, which I'll come to. But yeah, they're about 30 grams. So they're a bit bigger than a house mouse, and they actually do prey upon house mice when they get a chance. And there's a whole group of animals like this in our desert environments and in the coastal environments, all sorts of different species which are in the same group as the Antechinus. So they're carnivorous marsupials. So like the thylacines, the carnivorous marsupial, and the Tasmanian devil, and things like quolls, Antechinus are in that same broad group of the carnivores. They're like a shrew. People probably know what shrews are like. They're the Australian equivalent of a shrew. They do the same sort of thing as a shrew, living fast, dying young, eating insects. It's an amazing example of what's called convergent evolution, when we see an animal that's evolved to live in that niche of chasing down and hunting small invertebrates, a mammal, evolved in Australia from a marsupial origin and evolved in the rest of the world from a placental mammal origin, completely separate for 60 million years or more, and yet they're very similar. It's an amazing example of convergent evolution, but I reckon our Antechinus are better.
Now, you've just raised so many things I want to ask questions about him, though. One we must come back to is you're saying they're like a shrew, because from Shakespeare we all have this notion that shrews are rather mean-tempered creatures. Does that mean these are rather aggressive little darlings, or what?
Well, if you were anything of the size that they could eat, yes, they would be. But when we encounter them, like when we trap them, they're lovely animals. They occasionally bite, but, when they bite, they're not like rodents. They really rarely pierce the skin. I mean, so they're lovely animals. They won't just sit in your hand. They'll dart around at 1,000,000 miles an hour, but they're very easy to handle. And our interactions with them as humans are really quite nice. But if you were something that they could kill, they're ferocious killers. There's no doubt about it. They've got a really fast metabolism because they're small, so they have to eat a lot, and so they have to be pretty adept killers of invertebrates and small vertebrates like skinks.
Do they therefore not have ever-growing teeth in the front of their mouth?
No, they're like little cats. They're like cat-like teeth. So there's lots of really sharp, pointy teeth to break into the hard outer shell of invertebrates.
Now, a second thing you mentioned was a rather frenetic sex life, at least on the part of the males. I've heard about some of these from the northern quoll. What has Antechinus got?
Well, they do a similar sort of thing to the northern quoll. They're what's called a semilparous animal, which means They breed once and then they die. And that's much more common amongst invertebrates and it's really uncommon amongst the mammals. The reproductive system is really tightly timed so that the young are born in spring. So in Sydney it's probably around August, so it's late winter, early spring. The males start to get frantic. The females come into estrus, and for a 1 week period or so, there's a frenetic mating frenzy where the males it's thought that they'll gather at a particular spot. Females will come and choose who they want to mate with. And mating can last up to 13 hours, and then the female will go and partner with another male, and males will look for other females. And the sheer stress of this frenetic mating over this 1 week period causes build-up of stress hormones in the males, and all the males die pretty much synchronously within a week. So come early springtime, all the males are dead and the females are left to raise the young without the stress of males. And that's a pretty unusual sex life, certainly for mammals. And it's what the northern quoll does as well, and a few other of these carnivorous marsupials, but it really only works in places where there's quite strong seasonality. When seasons come, and it's pretty reliable that in the springtime all of the male's effort into reproducing will come to fruition in the production of young successfully.
You say the females also only live 1 year?
Well, they have the offspring, and because they're small, because of the stress of raising the young, because they can have, I think it's up to 13 young that hang off them because they don't really have a pouch. They've got this sort of region on their sort of lower abdomen where all the nipples are, and they'll have as many babies attached to those nipples as they can. And because they're a marsupial, the young are born in a tiny state. They climb onto a nipple and they then suckle there for many weeks, and they grow and grow in size such that the bundle of young attached to the female can be larger than the female herself, and she's dragging these animals around the forest with her. And just the sheer stress of that really wears her out, so that only about a third of all females will make it to breed a second year, and then only about a third of those or less will make it to a third year. It's pretty uncommon to survive a third year because they're so worn out and everything's trying to eat them, so they don't make it. But the males, all dead. They only live for about 11 months.
What if the males don't find a female? Do they live longer if they avoid this sexual activity?
Well, in the lab, if they're excluded from other males, so they don't have that stress of it, they'll survive. There are some accounts of males surviving in the wild, so that's even with interacting with other individuals, but it's quite rare. So it's the stress of there's fights with other males and so forth that causes the problem, not actually having sex itself, that causes a problem. If a male doesn't have sex, well, I guess he doesn't pass his genes on.
Yeah.
How it could work.
Way or the other.
The females, she'll have multiple partners, so her offspring will have a number of different fathers, and some really cool research that was done by Diana Fisher showed that the females who have multiple partners, her offspring have a better chance of surviving and than reproducing. So it really does pay to be promiscuous in terms of the fitness of her offspring. It's quite cool.
It is rather. It does go against all the norms for humans of monogamy and not even serial monogamy.
Yeah, there's no serial monogamy in Antechinus. Not when you've only got 11 months to live.
Something else that came up was you said Antechinus doesn't have a real pouch. Now that's the third of our little marsupials and monotremes that I've been talking to people about recently, and none of them did. The numbback doesn't have one, your fellow doesn't have one, and of course the good old echidna doesn't have one. So this notion of our marsupials and so on wandering around with beautifully developed pouches like kangaroos isn't actually the norm at all.
No, it's a bit surprising, yeah. But they still, like the way that they otherwise reproduce in producing young that are really quite underdeveloped, so having a very short gestation time, so from conception to birth, that's all true. It's just that the animals don't have a pouch that their young sit in or are protected in. In the case of the Antechinus, the young just hang on for their life to the nipple as they're dragged around the forest until they reach a size when they are stashed in a nest. They produce more young than there are nipples, like many marsupials, so really it's a race to the nipple, and then once you get there, they've just got to hang on as they're dragged around the forest as the female runs around to provide enough food to feed them.
Well, that's another survival of the fittest culling.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I just think it's this stereotype we have of, a pouch with a great big joey in it.
Yeah, well, that's in their name. The marsupium means pouch. So it's a bit of a misnomer when there's a whole group of them, a pretty large group, that don't actually have pouches at all.
Okay, well, there goes another one of the urban myths that we seem to like to have. Something else I've also discovered when I talk to people about these Australian critters is, where did that name come from? And quite often people just don't have a clue. Even when I was asking about numbats the other day, it turns out I had to go to Wikipedia. Now there's a source of all knowledge, and discovered that numbat was actually a typical Western inability to listen carefully to what the indigenous people were calling them. They're noombat or something like that, which is just a slightly different word.
Yeah, okay. Antechinus is, they don't really have a common name. People call them marsupial mice, but that's a bit of it confuses people because they think they're mice then. The Antechinus means like a hedgehog or hedgehog equivalent, which is, again, a bit strange, but it's trying to refer to the other insectivores that are in the world, because in the Northern Hemisphere and other places they have, as I said, a whole group of animals that are like shrews, that are insectivorous, that are basically equivalent to our Antechinus type animals, and that's why they're called Antechinus, a hedgehog equivalent.
Now, when you say hedgehog, having never really seen one except in books, I thought they were spiky sorts of creatures. Yeah,
that's what I mean. The hedgehogs are in a group of animals which are insectivorous, so don't worry about the spikes on them. It's more their lifestyle of the way that they live and the way that they eat. So I think that's why they named it a hedgehog equivalent or similar. I think that's what the literal translation means, but it's more referring to these Northern Hemisphere insectivorous-like animals, which are very much like an Antechinus, of which the hedgehog is one, and shrews are another example.
Now, another thing you said was that they're pretty good climbers, and they spend quite a bit of time in trees.
Yeah. So they probably nest in trees. They probably have multiple nests, but they're very agile. They'll run up the wall. So people, if you've got them in your house, you might see this mammal being able to seemingly climb a wall, because they've got amazing claws that just grab in, and they can scamper about up walls and in the roof and all over the place. So they're up and down trees quite regularly. There's been some research a few years ago that showed that they spend more time in trees when they've got competition from other animals on the ground, so they sort of avoid that competition by spending more time in trees. And if you take away that competitor on the ground, then they'll spend more time on the ground. But they're quite adept at living in trees. And they probably escape predation by being in trees, but then they probably face other predators when they're in the trees that are trying to eat them as well.
I was thinking that they're pretty little. Do they make a nice snack for cats?
Oh, yeah. I think probably foxes might find it a bit hard to get them, but cats probably would get them. But they've got a whole suite of native predators as well that they seem to know what to do with. So snakes and goannas and owls and diurnal birds, they're all trying to eat them as well. Quolls, everything's trying to eat them when you're that small. So they've got a pretty good anti-predator strategy, which does seem to work because they're, as I said, they're reasonably common still.
Are they solitary creatures?
Yes and no.
Not in the mating season.
No, that's right, they're not. They will share their home ranges with their offspring. So the males will get told to leave, so they'll move on, and the females will inherit the home range of their mother, so they'll hang around with their mother. I don't know that there's any evidence of sort of sharing of raising of young duties. So in terms of being social, yes, sort of family groups, but not to the extent of things like sugar gliders or that. They're very small. They're hard to study, these smaller details, because they scamper off into hollow logs here and there, and it's tricky to work out who's hanging around with who.
How do they communicate?
they do make a hiss when they're angry, and they do that with one another. They probably communicate with olfaction, so probably in their scent marks that come from the urine, as well as they've got a gland on their chest that they rub against trees that probably has encoded in it information about individuality as well as sex and reproductive condition, etc. So it's probably through olfaction and some auditory cues, but that might only be close up. I've only ever seen it sort of close up. I don't think you hear them howling across the forest. Like many small things that sort of scamper about, they probably use olfaction quite a lot, so that's scent marks.
Is that both males and females?
The females I don't think have the scent gland, but the males do as they advertise their location and status to other males and to females. And it really becomes most prominent during that breeding season time.
So here we have these large males. They're really only going to have a bit of a bang for a couple of weeks. What do they do the rest of their life? Do they
try to get big because they're fighting with other males and wrestling females? So they want to get big testicles, to be able to deliver a lot of sperm in that very short amount of time, and to be able to hang on to their female and to fight off other males and to impress females. It seems to be a pretty classic example of where you've got differences in the sizes of the sexes, where you've got competition for females, the males will fight with one another, and there'll be selection for a larger size. And that selection for larger size is not only genetic, they've got to forage to get big for the breeding season.
Right, it just seems sort of topsy-turvy, really. You've got a female who's going to raise 10 or so offspring, and she's littler than the male who really is only needed for not very long at all.
Yeah, that's sexual selection. Crazy. Like, it's a bit like the ornateness of some birds, which are, ridiculously ornate in the males for no particular reason. It comes at quite a significant cost to them. And it's really there to show off to females and show off to other males about their sexual prowess, perhaps, and it probably comes at a handicap to them.
They're all seem so strange. I recently interviewed somebody who uncovered a really complex mating dance, if you like, in krill of all creatures. Those tiny little keystone creatures under the ice there in the Antarctic. And yet they have this great sexual related dance that goes on for some period of time. And yet when you come to humans, we're sort of told it's a very different tale.
Yeah, maybe. We're sexually dimorphic too. Males are bigger than females. How much of a role competition amongst males and so forth plays there? No doubt it must play a role. Sexual selection and natural selection are the sort of two big evolutionary drivers of the traits of organisms.
Now, Peter, you seem to know quite a bit about Antechinus. Is that from first-hand work?
Yeah, we've done some work with them over the years, looking at factors that influence their survival over the winter, whether or not food limitation is important for them. We've done some work looking at how they respond to introduced predators. We've done some other work just looking at their habitat associations, where they like to be. They're great animals to work with.
That's what you said for the rats too.
Yeah, I probably like the small furry things.
I've got to ask you, what's their distribution like, either now or what it used to be?
They live in a really diverse range of habitats, so they can live in really moist forests, they can live in quite dry forests, they can live in woodland. They're quite cosmopolitan in where they can live. They can live in heathland as well. So they're probably more common, more abundant in the moister sort of habitats where there's a dense understory, but as I said, they can live in a whole range of different environments.
Now, you've got a range of these little creatures. Where do they fit into the whole set of ecosystems where they live? I mean, most animals manage to find a particularly useful niche that suits their abilities. What are these little critters like? Well,
they are insectivorous predators, so they're predators of insects, and they're living that lifestyle where they can exploit that prey and also live in trees and on the ground. So not many other animals do that, and they're exclusively nocturnal. So those dimensions of eating insects, living in the trees and on the ground and operating at night time and being a mammal. That's what their sort of niche is. They also do eat pollen, nectar, so they will move around and spread pollen around, and they do play a role in pollinating our native plants. And in particular, some of our native plants, like the Banksias, are really adapted to being pollinated by mammal pollinators like Antechinus. So they sort of supplement their insectivorous diet with pollen and nectar, so they play a positive role in terms of pollination. Probably keeping invertebrate numbers down if we want that to happen, although invertebrates probably don't want their numbers kept down, but they're in there doing that for their own purposes.
Are they big enough to eat any little birds' eggs, or are they far too small for that?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think we've done artificial egg experiments, and it's really, you sometimes see the teeth mark of Antechinus go in there and get them, but they probably struggle a bit with bigger eggs. Only the small ones they might get. If they could get them, I'm sure they would. So they do occasionally, but it's only really the small birds that do it. And we probably don't have a really good handle on how significant they are as nest raiders. We know that, for example, rats are. We know that possums are. We know that a lot of birds are nest raiders, but how much these Antechinus do it, I don't think there's enough evidence there.
Now, my favourite question, what really attracts you to Antechinus? What do you think are their most interesting or outstanding attributes?
Well, it's their life history, so the way that they live and die and reproduce. It's immensely fascinating. The fact that they're so similar in the way that they live to these northern hemisphere animals like shrews, and yet they're separated by millions of years in evolution, is also fascinating. And they are really just lovely animals to work with. They're so well behaved. They smell very sweet and lovely. They don't really bite. So in terms of being a research animal, just in terms of handling, they're lovely organisms.
If you get them in the house, are they a problem like mice can be, or should we just sort of say, let them be, they're not going to eat the wiring, they're going to be okay?
No, I don't think, look, I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think they do go for wiring as much, because when you've got rodents like the black rats or house mice, they tend to take out a lot of their social interactions and aggressions, etc., on their tails. So there's lots of biting of tails, and that may be one reason why there's a lot of nipping of wires, etc. And also they've got to do it to sort of keep their teeth sharp and so forth, so they tend to gnaw on a lot of things. Antechinus don't do that. They don't attack each other's tails. They tend to bite ears, and they don't really need to keep their teeth. They don't keep their teeth sharp in the same way rodents do. So I don't think biting of wires is so much of an issue. But, there's probably some sort of nuisance value in terms of having something scampering around your roof when you want to sleep. There's no doubt about that. If a family's set up there, they could possibly do some damage in terms of doing something to the electrics just by running over wires and doing that sort of thing. So people probably don't want them in their house, but if you could have them in a place where they lived and they were in the trees outside and they occasionally came in and sorted out your cockroaches for you and your spiders, that's possibly a good thing.
Well, that's another native creature that you have studied. Any more that you have?
Oh, well, if you wanted to talk about black rats or house mice, I'm happy to talk about those. Black rats are interesting just because of their relationship with humans over several thousands of years.
Well, I think you'll be getting a Skype from me
in
the next month or so. Thank you very much indeed. That's Associate Professor Peter Banks from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Sydney. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.